Tonight we're dealing with how we began the process of evaluating Islam through this Baha'i lens we've talked about from the very first course. And so we're going to talk again about axioms, which are the foundation of our rational examination of reality from a Baha'i point of view. Because while you may become a Baha'i out of joy and attraction and enthusiasm and just sheer love for what you discover in the friends or in the writings, ultimately you leave the valley of love, as Baha'u'llah describes in the 7 valleys. After you've been searching and are attracted and fall in love, you must extricate yourself from what he calls the claws of the eagle of love and ascend to the next valley, which is the valley of knowledge. And to do that, you need rational thought and rational tools. So we've talked about it before. We're going to talk about it again because it applies very much to how we approach both the life of Muhammad and what happens to Islam. So we're sort of springing off of what we talked about last time as regarding the breach in the covenant, what Muhammad intended to happen and what God ordained for Muhammad to intend to happen, and how it got abused. For example, if God and Muhammad foreknew that this was going to happen, you have 2 alternatives. Why did he not stop it from happening? Or was it foreordained to happen? Well, we're going to deal with that as one of our axioms derived from the writings. So once an axiom is established, it becomes a building block, a foundation for adding other axioms, combining them together in a syllogistic form, and thereby creating an argument or a syllogism. They become then the axioms, once they're proved, the standard or the mizan for the assessment of the truth of further assertions. They become the balance scale. So you weigh them in the balance. That's what that term means, that you have the truth in one side of the balance scales and you put your new learning or theory in the other side and you see if they balance out. So critical thinking is essential in our religious study or our studies of the religions. Baha'u'llah's Book of Certitude, as I've said before, is categorized by him as an argument. Now, by argument, of course, as I've also said, does not mean going tete-a-tete with someone. It means a logical, logically persuasive discourse. Shoghi Effendi also calls it an apologia. An apologia is a scholarly work in defense of something. And in the particular case of the Book of Certitude, it is an apologia for the Bab and the Babi faith, a defense, if you will, a proof of the Babi faith and its validity. Since both are infallible, and that is by both I'm referring to Baha'u'llah and Shoghi Effendi, then it must obviously be both things. It is both an argument and an apologia, or it's an apologia in the form of an argument. And both of these are logical discourses. Both require critical thought, a quality or a capacity or a tool which I'm afraid is sadly lacking in today's culture because it's not being taught in schools and because those who might teach them in schools aren't capable of doing it themselves too often. So the initial premises must be true. The internal logic of the premises and their relationship must be true and valid. Now, how can something be valid but not true? The arguments deriving or proceeding from them must employ logically sound processes. So if you say all men are noble, well, That's a major premise. And your next minor premise is Frank is a man. And so your conclusion is Frank, and then I put in a little parenthetical clause here, who happens to like robbing convenience stores, is noble. Well, something's wrong, obviously. So either our logic is not valid, or our premises, one of them, is not true. Well, we know that Frank is a man is okay. So all men are noble must not be correct. We have there a syllogism which is logically valid, but it is untrue. So we begin our Baha'i lens for as this particular foundation. We can begin elsewhere, but we're going to begin tonight with the axiom, Baha'u'llah is a manifestation of God. And then we go on with that to define what is a manifestation of God, what powers they have, and so on, that they are perfect in everything they do, and that everything they do has a special divine purpose. Everything they say is true, and all their actions are immaculate. The term immaculate is translated sometimes as infallible. And of course, both terms apply equally. So to arrive at this first one, though, you must prove on your own to yourself that Baha'u'llah is what he claims to be. And so that's the first task, if you will, after you fall in love with the faith and with Baha'u'llah. That's one of your first tasks. If he is who he claims to be, you want to be sure that you know what the proof of that claim is. So Baha'u'llah asserts that manifestations are inherently infallible. And Abdul Baha says in another passage that infallibility can be conferred on someone else, but the manifestation is the only being who is inherently so from the beginning. This is part of their essential reality, part of their character. And so we have the fact in the Baha'i writings that Baha'u'llah confers infallibility on Abdul Baha. Once he does that, Abdul Baha is infallible because Baha'u'llah has the power as a manifestation to do that. Abdul Baha has the power to confer infallibility on Shoghi Effendi and on the Universal House of Justice, and does so. So we have here as a premise then the manifestations are sinless, and more importantly, as we've looked at this passage so many times and we'll continue to, that the essence of belief in divine unity consists in regarding everything the manifestation does and says as identical with the will of God. That once you attain that station of understanding and taking to heart and accepting that is valid, then to a certain degree you have entered the city of certitude. But it doesn't mean you stay there, because you may come across something in the writings that you don't understand, and when you're first a Baha'i or even later, you may be attacked by doubt. The most conducive thing to doubt, in addition to discovering something you don't understand, is cynicism of others, the cynicism of materialist scholars in particular. And I'll give you some examples later. But for now, suffice it to say that once you accept this in your heart and confirm it by years of study and practice and reading, then this becomes your mizan, your belief that Baha'u'llah is who he says he is, that what he does has the authority and power of the will of God, and so that you accept the infallibility of the House of Justice because you believe that Abdul Baha had the power to confer that, and he received that from Baha'u'llah. So you can see the succession of critical thinking there. One derives from the other. So once you establish your understanding of, belief in, and acceptance of, and confirmation of your belief in Baha'u'llah, all kinds of things derive from that one premise alone, namely that everything he says in his writings is true. So when I say it becomes your mizan, it means this. When Baha'u'llah defines manifestation as having this authority and this status, it means that when he designates Muhammad as a manifestation, then those qualities apply to Muhammad. So that means that when you weigh Muhammad in the balance and you see that he does things, not robbing stores, but he does things that that you might find out of context to be contrary to what you have understood, perhaps in reading the Kitab-i-Aqdas, where one of the laws for personal conduct says you don't hit other people. Well, Muhammad used a sword and with his armies attacked other people. Seems contrary to the syllogism we just set up. So that means something, either our syllogism must be invalid, or one of our second premise here is untrue. And so what we realize is that as we've read in the understanding of and justification for these, is we go to the writings and see what the writings have to do insofar as justifying Muhammad's actions. And we've already looked at those from Abdul-Baha, and we'll look at them again. Muhammad's battles against the Quraysh and also against other tribes in his effort to unify Arabia under a single religion and create, that should be to create a just polity as modeled by the Constitution of Medina, was justified and ordained by God. So we have, let's put it this way, we have to accept that as true in light of what we've accepted as our first premise. We may not feel like we understand why it's justified, and that requires deeper study. How is it justified? So, as I say, as a secondary conclusion that forces us to study and use these tools of logical discourse, or simply critical thinking and just ordinary common sense, if you will, either Muhammad's actions were naught but manifest justice, or else the narratives about his actions are inaccurate or incorrect, or the initial premise is false. When doubts arise, reconfirm the proofs of the initial premise. And so, are you sure that Baha'u'llah, that you believe Baha'u'llah as he says he is? And are you sure you believe everything he says is true? And if you do, then you know that Muhammad is, as Baha'u'llah claims him to be, inherently immaculate, and that what he does is correct. And so you recheck what he's described as doing and how he's described as doing it. Now, one thing you will notice, if you've done any reading on your own about Muhammad and Islam, is that there are, I don't want to guess how many, but there's so many variations on narratives about his life and what he did or did not do. I have therefore selected through my Baha'i lens those narratives that comply with what I know to be true. Now, I haven't done it haphazardly or willy-nilly. I have chosen sources that I think are also accurate, for reasons that it would take me all night to explain each one. So you don't have to accept it, of course, from me. Study on your own and see what you find. But you will find, in other words, don't be disturbed is my point, when you look online and find something that seems to contradict what we've observed here about the justice with which Muhammad functioned. Because there are those people who aren't Muslims who will denigrate Muhammad. There are those Muslims who will have a totally different interpretation of who Muhammad was or what Muhammad did, and so on. And this is why the future of Islam is really a series of one faction conquering another faction in one caliphate, overthrowing another caliphate, so that again, as we noticed in the last class, at the death of Muhammad and the breach of his covenant, Islam is forever shattered. It doesn't mean that great things don't derive from it, as we're going to see tonight. Another premise from the Baha'i writings is that when a manifestation appears and a new revelation occurs, the entire earth is changed by it, whether it knows the source of that change or not. We're going to see that one of them, of course, is the Industrial Revolution, which occurred simultaneous with the declaration of the Bab and the events leading up to that and stemming from it. The whole earth was changed. Knowledge became revisioned. As we collect axioms, we can spot interactions among them to construct syllogisms. As we collect syllogism, we can construct an argument, so long as we first establish the truth of the initial premise and over time acquire certitude that the axioms themselves are both true and valid. Therefore, we can conclude that the authoritative axioms of Baha'u'llah, Abdul-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and the Universal House of Justice are infallible and thus can be used as the balance or standard, what we put on the other side of the scales, whereby we can examine and draw conclusions about statements regarding reality, including religious history itself, but only if we have first proved through our own independent investigation that Baha'u'llah is what he claims to be, which is usually an ongoing process, not a single point of recognition, a conversion, a moment of becoming. That's why the word conversion is not really used that much in the Baha'i faith, because we realize we're all works in process, and that becoming a Baha'i is really more, as I say here, asserting a goal that you strive to attain, not an instantaneous transformation of character or destiny. Problems for Baha'i students in philosophy or religious studies courses. Now, this is important for you to understand. Particularly if you have children, or in my case, grandchildren, who are in school, and particularly in college, and they're in a philosophy course or religious studies course, and they're dedicated Baha'is, and they're asked to write a paper proving some metaphysical point. And they will quote from Abdul-Baha as a proof of something. And the teacher will give them a low grade. And I know this because I had so many of the students in the Baha'i Club through the years say, look what I got on this paper. I mean, because they know Abdul-Baha is authoritative and is a valid source of authority, but the teacher doesn't accept that. And so what they don't realize is they have to prove to the teacher that the first premise is correct, namely Abdul-Baha is infallible. So they have to first prove that God exists, that spiritual reality exists, that God sends messengers or manifestations, and that should be or instead of Baha, that Baha'u'llah is a manifestation, that Baha'u'llah appoints Abdul-Baha and confers infallibility on it. So they miss all those steps. And even, of course, it would take a good lengthy thesis to do that much. So the believer, we are always a work in progress. We are constantly striving to enter the city of certitude, and we can enter it, but once having achieved a degree of certitude, we need to stay there by continuing to expand understanding and support for valid assumptions or conclusions. And one of those is studying Muhammad and accepting Muhammad, not simply on the blind faith that Baha'u'llah says so. Remember that if you were a Christian, and as I was growing up, how do I know the Bible tells me so, that little song? Well, the Bible tells you lots of things, and some of them are contradictory. And as we saw in our first classes on Christianity, most of those who heard Christ misunderstood and took as literal what was intended to be uh, analogical or symbolic. So we are constantly increasing our certitude, or else we're declining. As the Baha'i rings say, there is no such thing as stasis, not in this life, not in the next. We're always in motion. We're either moving forward or we're declining. And to be, as Abdul Baha says about the next world, and to be in stasis is tantamount to declining. Otherwise, the believer may fall prey to the cynicism of those who would destroy that belief or deny the existence of metaphysical reality or the interaction, or as my brother, I don't think he coined the term, but he used this a lot in his studies of the relationship between science and religion, the interpenetration between these two dimensions of reality, if you want to think of it that way. They're not two realities, though. They're two aspects of a single unified reality, which has both a physical and a metaphysical aspect. There are no fixed standards or set methodologies, should be plural, for accomplishing this ongoing process of learning and enlightenment. Furthermore, what works for one person may not work for another. And so deepening, the tools for deepening will differ from person to person. And they will know after a while what works best for them. Furthermore, what works at one point in your development as a Baha'i may not work as well at another. So you may start out as accepting the faith because it has a logical explanation for the history of religion, and then go on to become very spiritually attracted just to the pure beauty of the beloved and of the teachings of the beloved. Or conversely, you may fall in love, be attracted, and then you must ascend to the city of knowledge and certitude. Baha'u'llah has designed a regimen for ensuring that we never become content or complacent with our present condition, that we are forever in a condition of becoming, each phase of which is conducive to increased joy and delight and the ever more expansive understanding of God's divine plan and of our specialized part in that plan. And I don't need to go over that in detail. Suffice it to say that that regimen on the simplest level is a regimen of daily prayer, reflection, of taking ourselves into account at the end of the day, and so on. And if you follow that regimen, you're never far away from your communion with Baha'u'llah or your communion with God through Baha'u'llah. We are, each of us, a unique creation with a distinct combination of attributes, powers, and potentialities. As Baha'u'llah says in this very famous passage, we are a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. And he goes on to say in this same passage that this is the goal of the manifestations, is to provide that education. And of course, we have that education. And this means, as I said long ago in a letter that was printed in what was the American Baha'i as a newspaper format as it was then, and we had letters to the editor, which were sometimes controversial and so on. That I said that the letters from the House of Justice might well be perceived as letters from God, because effectively they are. If they are in the infallible and divine instrument through which we are guided, then a new letter from them is a letter from God, and we should receive it in that vein and look upon it as the same thing, a further step in the regimen designed for our progression. Or in the case of the letter that we just received a few days ago, and that we were reminded of by our National Assembly today, a letter responding to an individual so troubled by the calamitous events taking place in our world today. And they include a copy of that letter in response from the House of Justice to that individual. So we should look upon that as helping us have certitude and peace of mind and know how to respond. So think of axioms, if you will, as keys to unlocking further verities. Baha'u'llah establishes the proofs for discovering the advent of a manifestation. He does that in the second half of the Book of Certitude. And if you aren't aware of it, I suppose many of you are, the Book of Certitude, which is over 200 pages long, was revealed in 2 days and 2 nights. So I don't recall if I found out before, but I presume that the first part was the first day and the second part was the second day. In any case, it's divided into 2 parts, the first of which is a proof of the validity of the prophecies of Christ regarding the advent of both Muhammad and also the Bab. The second part is describing the powers, the capacities, and the proofs of the manifestation. Baha'u'llah sets forth how to recognize the attributes, powers of someone claiming to be a manifestation. If Baha'u'llah asserts that a certain historical figure was a manifestation, we conclude his advent, that is the advent of that person, was recognizable and that his attributes and powers comply with this paradigm. So, for example, and we'll see that later, Shoghi Effendi says, point blank, Joseph was a manifestation. Well, where is the Muhammad, of course, devotes a whole surah to Joseph, and we'll look at that later. But so that's a syllogism right there. Baha'u'llah defines a manifestation. Shoghi Effendi says that Joseph is a manifestation. Therefore, Joseph complies with all the attributes and powers that Baha'u'llah assigns to these incredible figures. And even though we don't have a text of Joseph, we do have the representation of some of the things he did and said in both the Old Testament and more accurately in the Quran. Let me take a sip of my consoling peppermint tea. The more axioms we acquire about how history proceeds, the more likely we are to acquire accurate assumptions about particular sequences of events, how they occurred. When Muhammad told the Arabs to go away, remember last class when he asked for pen and paper that they might not be led astray, and they refused, saying, we've got everything what we need. And he finally gives up and says, go away. Does that mean he gives up on the religion itself, that he realizes, oh, it's fruitless? No. When they refused to grant his request for pen and paper, he was not necessarily abandoning hope that the religion would still succeed, but only that this particular insurance against schism was possible. In short, it is not God's plan that we fail. Foreknowledge, and this is an important axiom, which we can prove, but it's proven by Abdul Baha in some answered questions. Foreknowledge does not imply causation. Now, what does that mean? It means because you know something is going to happen, doesn't mean that you caused it to happen. Now, we may see evidence of this in our personal lives. You see 2 cars heading at each other from the top of a building, and one's going one way, and there's impossible for them to stop in time. They're going to T-bone at the intersection, and you know it's going to happen. Well, it doesn't mean you had anything to do with causing it to happen. But when we're dealing with the foreknowledge of the manifestation, we're talking about the fact that Muhammad probably knows that schism is going to happen, but he doesn't mean for it to happen. He doesn't will for it to happen. He gives every opportunity for the followers to do otherwise. Therefore, he's ultimately doing it for the knowledge of humankind, to know that, hey, we had a chance to get it right. And if we had gotten it right at this point, nothing would have been hurt thereby. You still would have had the same sequence of events, in the same way that if the kings and rulers by chance had have agreed to follow his requisites for the most great peace, we would have had the most great peace. All they had to do was follow his recommendation. The fact that they didn't doesn't mean that he meant for it to happen that way. It was foreseen that it would happen that way, and we see that in the Testaments and so on, and various religious scriptures. But that's not causative. It's saying, I'm afraid this is going to happen, but you're still responsible for your actions. So, foreknowledge does not imply causation. Muhammad may foreknow failure, but he still provides the opportunity for success, that humankind in the future will comprehend the necessity of abiding by the commands of the manifestation and the dedication to upholding their covenant. So we should learn from that as Baha'is how precious the covenant is, how close, as we study our own history, that covenant of Baha'u'llah came to be broken. Very, very close. If it had not been for, we'll get into that later, but suffice to say, if it hadn't been for the stalwart allegiance of a handful of individuals, it would have gone awry. Nothing in God's plan for the history of humankind would have become disrupted, would have been, that's misstated, would have become disrupted or gone awry had the succession gone as planned. The transition to the day of days would have been easier, even as the course of the present transition to the lesser peace is now contingent on our actions right here in this day. So, in other words, this isn't just past history, it's present history that this applies to. What we do now has a direct effect on the future of how easy or how painful the lesser peace will appear. The seal of the prophets. This is an episode just to interject, to demonstrate how important it is that we read our writings. This has to do with a meeting I went to, an interfaith meeting with Muslims at a gathering, and we were discussing various religious topics. And at the time, I had the thought that, well, maybe by seal of the prophets, which Muhammad says, he says, I am a man like you, but I am an apostle of God, and I am the seal of the prophets. He says that in the Quran. I said, maybe by seal, he means that as a seal ring says this letter is from so-and-so, maybe he is the seal of the prophets in that sense, that he has the qualities, the attributes, is a symbol of prophethood. Excuse me. What happened here? I went back. Oh, I went back. So I said, what about that? And the Muslim kind of laughed at me and he says, well, I appreciate you're trying to pronounce Quran correctly. He was obviously being condescending. He says, but the word khatam, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, is, or excuse me, is khatam the seal, or maybe anbiya is seal. I don't know. One of them is it means the seal. In any case, you can you can Google it. We can Google anything, can't we? He said, no, the word, it definitely means seal. It means the end of things. Everybody who speaks Arabic knows that. It can't mean anything else. And so we got, on the way home, I was with a dear friend of mine and fellow translator, Amullah Himat, and his son, who became a PhD at the University of Chicago and now a teacher, Kaveh. And he said, well, I wonder if there's a distinction between what Muhammad calls the Nabi and what he calls Rasul. In other words, some are prophetic, but they're not manifestations, and maybe that's the key, and so on. Well, the fact is that I don't know why I didn't know this at this point. I'd read the Igan many times, but Baha'u'llah explains it perfectly clearly. And we've said this before, but I'll read this again. The mystery of this theme hath in this dispensation, and there should be a quote there because this is a direct quote from the Igan, where it's part of a couple of pages that he deals with this crucial problem. The mystery of this theme hath in this dispensation been a sore test unto all mankind. So I didn't feel so bad. I was part of mankind. Behold, how many are those who, clinging unto these words, have disbelieved him who is their true revealer. What, we ask, could this people presume the term first and last when referring to God, glorified be his name, to mean? If they maintain that these terms bear reference to this material universe, how could it be possible when the visible order of things is still manifestly existing? Nay, in this instance, by first is meant no other than the last, and by last, no other than the first. I didn't include enough of that. He goes on to explain that every manifestation is the first and the last. They are the end result of everything that's gone before, and they are the beginning of everything that it proceeds from them. So Christ says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. And so all the prophets, Baha'u'llah goes on to say, are the first and the last. There's also, of course, the allusion to the fact that he is the last in those manifestations who prophesy the day of days, as opposed to the advent of the day of days. So their history is no longer looking forward to this time. We're in it. We're now looking at the present and what's happening now. We're looking forward to the golden age of Baha'u'llah, but we're in process of the day of days has already occurred. The first and second trumpet blasts have blasted. Then there's another incident that I mentioned before, but I'll repeat it. I don't know why I believe, I only know I believe. This was a response to an individual who was very sincere, and we should not disdain his belief at all. It's the kind of belief that they used to have in the Protestant church when I was there, when you were asked, if you've received Christ into your life, come up to the altar now. And of course, anyone still sitting in their pew was looked upon as a non-believer, I guess. And so I usually complied and went to the altar. I didn't know what I meant by it exactly. And that's the point. It is the equivalent to the valley of love. You have an intense attraction. But in time, the believer must extract himself or herself from the claws of the eagle of love and ascend to the valley of knowledge. That valley requires study, rational examination of that to which the lover is attracted. Why am I attracted to this? Is it worthy of my attraction? What is the reason that I should be attracted? Because you can be attracted to something that's not good for you, believe me. This happens, of course, if you're in a state of ill health and you are in bad physical condition. You may be attracted to sweets. You may be attracted to drugs. You may be attracted to all kinds of things that will debase you and injure you. Belief based solely on blind faith, as I think we dealt with this the second class, the first class, will not withstand the onslaught of test and logical examination. Likewise, if faith is based on a spurious or faulty axiom, then the foundation will be weak and further axioms or logical conclusions may not be sound. For example, assume you assert as axiomatic that killing or the use of force is always wrong. Muhammad employed force both in defending the people of Medina and in freeing the debased tribes from their pernicious injustice with others and with their own people. Therefore was Muhammad wrong. Since a manifestation is immaculate and can do no wrong, does that mean Muhammad was not a manifestation? No, it means what he did, of course, was justified, and that your premise was wrong. Even though, of course, in the Kitabi Agdas, Baha'u'llah says you should never hit another person. Well, again, and yet Abdullah says, if you are hurting someone in defending someone else, that's justified. So we're talking about conditions here, about axioms in the context of history and of events. And so when we look at the axioms about the progress, and we'll finish with this point here. And I've shown them to you before, but now maybe they have a little more impact and import. These axioms from the Guardian about Islam. Ali's appointment was clear to the caliphs, who actually disregarded the Prophet's oral statements. Okay, so the Sunni, as I recall, do not believe that Muhammad called for pen and paper. So is he referring to that, or is he referring to the oral statements at the Pool of Qum? Probably he's referring to the oral designation of Ali as his successor at the Pool of Qum, at the sermon at the Pool of Qum. The usurpation occurred immediately after the Prophet's death. Ali did not feel unqualified to be the successor, but wished to avoid schism, which unfortunately could not be prevented. Now, it doesn't mean could not have ever been prevented. It means under the circumstances which had occurred at this point, all the people were off on this expedition, and so he had no followers to help him. There was nothing he could do. The schisms that have afflicted the religions preceding the faith of Baha'u'llah establish its distinction from all previous revelations and single it out among all other dispensations, as stated by Abdul Baha. The guidance vouchsafed to the Imams regarding the laws and institutions of Islam was absolute and unqualified. Their infallibility was derived directly from the manifestation. Muhammad conferred infallibility upon the Imams. The Bab's descent from the Imam Hussein is no doubt a proof of the validity of the imamate. According to Nabil, the dream the Bab had made him first conscious of his revelation. And that dream is he, like Baha'u'llah in the Sia Chow, the Bab had a dream vision in which he was imbibing the blood from the throat of the martyred Imam Hussein, whose head was severed from his body on the plains of Karbala. The precedence of the name Hussein over Ali does establish the greatness of the Imam Hussein. So we would do well to study a little bit about the life and writings and teachings of the Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein, of course, you'll notice in the Book of Certitude, Many of the quotes they're not they're more than a few quotes from the Imams, particularly from Ali. Uh, Imam Hussein has, as attested by the Igan, been endowed with special grace and power among the Imams. Hence the mystical reference to Baha'u'llah as the return of the Imam Hussein, meaning the revelation in Baha'u'llah of those attributes with which Imam Hussein had been specifically endowed. Joseph was one of the sent ones of the Quran, meaning a manifestation of God. Now I'm going to show you a list later of all of those prophets, both major manifestations and minor prophets in the Igan later, not tonight. The friend should uphold Islam as a revealed religion in teaching the cause, but need not at present make any particular attempt to teach it solely and directly to non-Baha'is at this time. And that was in 1941. Things have changed now, and we can teach. It used to be that we weren't, we were specifically ordained when I first became a Baha'i, or are mandated not to teach people from the East. There was this extreme danger at the time that they would try to discover from you the Baha'is in Iran or other Middle Eastern countries and imprison them. It happened. The mission of the American Baha'is is no doubt to eventually establish the truth of Islam in the West. American Baha'is. The spirit of Islam, no doubt, was the living germ of modern civilization. And we'll see some of the things they contributed over the next two sessions, which derived its impetus from the Islamic culture in the Middle Ages, a culture that was the fruit of the faith of Muhammad. And there's the source for this, all of these quotes that I've just, these 12 passages. So that will be the end for tonight of my presentation.